What is up, good people? Welcome back to the video version of the Tone Mob podcast. Thank you so much for hanging out. Thanks for clicking on this. Thanks for liking and subscribing and all of that good stuff. This week, I am talking to Jack Hetherington and Nick Conte from Guitar Center. These dudes work in the vintage department of the world's largest retailer of musical instruments, so you know they've got stories, their instruments have stories, their customers have stories. We're riddled with stories on this one, and these dudes are just the ones to tell it. I really enjoyed this conversation. We talk about how they got into all this, they tell some crazy tales of guitars, and, well, just let them explain it, all right? Let's get into this. Let's get into this episode. Come on, let's go. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Tone Mob Podcast, the show about guitar stuff, occasionally, sometimes. I'm your host, Blake Weiland, and with me today, I have Jack Hetherington and Nick Conte from Guitar Center. Wow, something went down my throat right in that very moment. That's very convenient. Woo! From Guitar Center, specifically the vintage side of the business, which I think will be really interesting. There's probably a million places we could start with this, but probably the best place would be to take you guys individually. When you guys started playing, what got you interested in vintage instruments, and kind of how you ended up doing what you're doing, and we can go from there.
All right. Well, I'll jump in. So wow. It's been at this point such a long journey, but so I'll make it brief because I tend to get long-winded. But yeah, so I was going to college and I was studying like history, and I wanted to be like a teacher and a basketball coach, and that was kind of the plan. But I'd always really been into music and classic rock, and I tried taking guitar lessons when I was young during like summer camp, but I was way more interested in just running around and doing that kind of stuff, so it didn't stick. And then it's kind of a funny story, but I was out to dinner with one of my best friends and his parents. They'd taken us out to dinner. We're just sitting there, just rapping, and the mom was like, "So, what do you want to do when you get out of college?" And I was like, wow. And this just came out. I'd never talked like this before, never mentioned this before. I was like, you know what? I think I just want to play guitar and like make music. And it was like that kind of glaring and kind of not in keep with everything else probably that we had been talking about. And so like within 3 months, I had left college and went back to New York City, where I'm from. I had bought like a pawn shop Strat a few months prior to that, and that ended up being kind of part of this crazy story. And my girlfriend at the time got me guitar lessons for Christmas, and I took it really seriously because I was late to the game. At that point, I was like 20, so I was like an old man in rock and roll terms. And so I just started taking the lessons really seriously, playing a bunch. I knew I needed to get into a band right away if I was going to really make something happen. And so I did that for a long time, had a lot of really great experiences, recorded a bunch of cool stuff, did stuff at Sony in the city there. And then having lived in the city for a long time, it just got to the point where it was like, okay, it's not happening here. I mean, cool stuff's happening, but I'm not getting signed. I really need to get signed, just tunnel vision. And my wife and I had just had a daughter at that point. So we're like, all right, well, what do we want to do now? And the choices were pretty much Los Angeles, where I had some family and they could put us up while we looked for a place, or we were thinking about Austin, Texas, which was just cool and musical and all that stuff. So we decided to come out, take advantage of my aunt and family being down in Orange County, and we got an apartment in Hollywood. And I was bartending at that time, so I was walking down Sunset Boulevard, and I was handing out resumes, and nobody was hiring. What kind of following do you have? And just all that kind of stuff. I got here like 3 days ago. I got like $90. Can I just, maybe prove myself first? And they're like, well, you really need somebody with a following. So I'm walking down the street. I'd never been to Los Angeles before that, never been to Hollywood. And I'm on Sunset Boulevard, and I look across the street, and there's Guitar Center, which at that point was almost as big as it is now. We have a little bit more space. And I'd never heard of Guitar Center. It was all, the 48th Street stores, Sam Ash, Manny's, things like that. So I'm like, well, clearly I need to cross the street and go see what's going on at Guitar Center. And this is going way back. It was like 1997. And so I did, and I ended up getting hired, not that day, but the next day, in the vintage room, because I had started getting into vintage guitars in the city, in Manhattan. And it kind of went from there. And I kept on playing and took a little break from Guitar Center to do one last hurrah with the rock and roll thing. Got close again. Didn't happen, no problem. Came back to Guitar Center. Ended up working in the vintage room for a couple more years. Went out and ran stores for about 5 years. And then came back to first run a store down in Fountain Valley. And then post-recession, when everything just kind of went nuts, they asked me to come back to Hollywood and just kind of help get the wheels back on the track. And that was a long process. But shortly after I was asked to do that, Nick came on board, and we've been working together. We knew each other from having both been, I'm stealing some of his thunder here, but both of us having been store managers prior to me coming back to Vintage. And Nick and I started working together back in about 2012. It's been an awesome ride the whole time.
Cool. How'd you get into all this, Nick?
Well, so my dad was a guitar player, right? So I was kind of a guitar bass player, and I was just kind of brought up in a musical family. And so he had vintage guitars as I was growing up, but I couldn't touch them, right?
Sure.
So my first guitar was, I think, it was a Harmony set that was probably from JCPenney's or something like that, battery powered amp Strat, knockoff or whatever. And then so I got to play that, you know what I mean? And then, kind of, learn on that and do all that stuff. Then I would kind of upgrade to, Mexican Strats, Telly, stuff like that. And then finally, I don't even know how old I was when he allowed me to start playing the guitars, but you know what I mean? It was always just like I was eyeballing him across the room, you know what I mean? Like it's the forbidden fruit, you know what I mean? So so finally when I got those, I just noticed that they just, to me, just seemed to feel better, sound a little bit warmer. And then when I started playing in bands around the Detroit area, that I was always playing with some older people, and they all had vintage instruments too. So that's kind of how I first got the bug. And then, then fast forward to now, when I started doing this gig in 20, I started with Guitar Center in 2003 as just working in accessories, just started off there and just worked my way up through the ranks. And then ever since we've been in Hollywood now for the last 10, 12 years, you're just surrounded by all these things, and you just get like a real appreciation for them.
It's a pretty special thing. I remember when I first started getting into I played guitar for a long time before I actually got into gear. I mean, becoming a gear nerd and obsessed with every little bit of it. And my grandpa, I knew he kind of played guitar, but I mostly knew him as playing piano. And one day, it's kind of a weird story. So he had this Les Paul Jr. in his closet. And I've told this story on the podcast before, but I didn't really know that much about vintage guitars at all, but I knew a little bit. And he knew I played guitar. And he was watching Antiques Roadshow with my grandma, and somebody brought out an early 50s Junior. And they was appraising it or whatever. And he was like, well, I've got one of those in the closet, along with 2 tweed champs. and it was like, what? You do? And he pulled it out and he showed my grandma, yeah, look, it's the same thing. And he didn't really know much about it. And so he talks to my dad's friend who knew a lot more about it at the time. And he was like, well, it's all cracked and stuff. Maybe I should take it and refinish it. Right. Yeah. And then he's like, no, don't do that. So he just kind of put it back in the closet. And it was a couple years later, I heard that story and I was like, well, let me take a look at it. And I look at it and the bridge is all kind of pulled forward, as happens on those and whatever. And so I took it to my local repair store and they did a great job on it and got it all fixed up. And I just brought it back to him just because he didn't know where to go. And so I brought it back here. Your guitar is playable now. And he was like, yeah, that's great. How about you keep it? So that was nice. The Junior you see over my shoulder there. That was his. No way. Yeah. So that was my first vintage instrument. So I hit it pretty strong out of the park, I feel like, by total accident.
Yeah, man.
So
Yeah, you came out of the gates pretty strong with that one for sure.
yeah, it's a beauty. I love it. It's fantastic.
Yeah, and that's such a big part of the whole like vintage trip are the stories and all and the things that still walk in today, and so many of them are still in the family for the last however many years, decades, etc. And I think the lore and like literally just the smell of it. I mean, back when I first worked at in the vintage room in Hollywood, we had an entire section of the warehouse that was just vintage cases.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, the reality is there were a lot more of them back then because there was just more of this available. There's definitely not as much as there used to be out there. And you would walk everything would smell just like it's that's the warehouse, just doesn't really smell like anything. And then you'd crack the door that you'd have to swing open, this big, huge, heavy, like old school metal prefab door. And it would just hit you, that smell of old cases and amps just sitting on the floor there and stuff. And that's one of the things that immediately just got me hooked fast. Like I was kind of like you. I was just trying to learn how to play guitar and, get the best amp I could afford or the best pedal I could afford. Bought my first pedal at Sam Ash on 48th Street. It was one of the early Seymour Duncan pedals that they put out.
Mm-hmm.
Sounded good to me. But once I got hit and bit by the bug, it was just all those things add up to just being super cool. And it kind of like never ends nearly 30 years later. It's just still cool.
This is going to be an impossible task that I'm going to ask out of both of you, but I'd be remiss if I didn't ask the question since you started talking about the stories and the lore. You guys have seen, in that time frame and working for, obviously the biggest music retailer on the planet, you have to have seen the craziest stuff come through. Like, I mean, obviously there are legendary shops all over the country, and I've been to a lot of them, and they've got crazy stories. But you guys just you're all across the U.S. in a way that nobody else is, with tendrils into all these different communities. You guys have to have the craziest stories. So let's hear some crazy vintage guitar stories. What pops to your brain when somebody says, "What's the craziest vintage guitar story you got?" Like, I'm sure there's 30 of them, but what's the top couple?
Nick, you got one off the top of your head?
Well, I mean, there's always the Joe Bonamassa trash bag flying V story. I mean, that's kind of been told ad nauseum, I suppose, but that is probably the coolest story or coolest guitar story that we've ever had. So,
weirdly enough, I don't know that story. So,
oh, really? Okay,
yeah.
So I guess I'll try to keep it as short as possible. So basically, it was a day. I think it was my day off, but like I always check my emails on my day off. I'm just a gear addict, So
yeah.
And we got this email, and the subject line of it just said V. That was it. It just said V, right? So I open up the mail, and I'm like, okay, what's a V? That's probably cool, right? I open up the first picture, and I'm like, what is that? I'm like, is that like an '80s Carino one? Then next picture, I'm like, I wonder if that's a Max. And then like we kept, opening. And I'm like, man, I think that's a 58 Flying V. I think it is, So,
Mm-hmm.
So basically, Joe and I are really good friends, and we text all the time back and forth about guitars because he's a gear nerd too. So I sent him photos of the guitar, and I was like, hey man, I'm like, what do you think of this? And he's like, man, it looks pretty good, And I was like, I'm going to fly up and look at it in Sacramento tomorrow, right? So he was actually up, I forget where he was actually at, but he had just bought an old car, and he was driving it down. And at the same time I was going to Sacramento, he was passing through Sacramento.
Okay.
So I flew up there. He ended up meeting me at the store. We had an appointment for the lady to be there. I forget what time. She like an hour went by, an hour and a half went by. We just thought we were, getting ghosted or whatever like that. But then she finally shows up with this vinyl acoustic gig bag, with this guitar, and Joe and I unzip it, open it up, and it's a Flying V. It's a real Flying V, and it belonged to this guy named Gino Landry. He was a saxophone player, and he actually I think it was his niece selling it out of the estate, and I think like he was a big saxophone player. So she took the saxophones into the store. I forget what kind they were, but like the expensive, like the $10,000 saxes or whatever like that are.
Mm-hmm.
And so she took those in to a store up there. And she also took the guitar, and they told her, we don't buy stuff like this. So, just take it over to Guitar Center.
Wow.
So that's how that guitar came into a store. And, and I mean, she would have taken $500 for it.
Wow.
Yeah.
So the trash bag part of that is that she had literally brought it in before Nick and Joe met her in a trash bag and was like...
No, she found it when she was clearing out the house. It was just leaning up against the wall she said, a bin liner. And Joe was like, a bin liner? He's like, you mean like a trash bag? She's like, yeah. So that's how it got nicknamed the trash bag.
Wow.
And luckily,
Gotcha.
like Joe he was in Germany, and he had actually bought an original Flying V case like 6 months earlier. So he actually had a case for it, which is impossible to find, Mm-hmm. So that's a really good one. I mean, driving through, we bought a 2 pickup 59 Les Paul Custom that Joe actually also owns too, which is just insanely rare. They're usually always 3 pickups.
Mm-hmm.
But the same thing, I got an email about it. And the next day I was on a flight I think I flew into Baltimore or Philly, and I'm driving through like Amish country, to go look at this guitar 2 hours, then get it, then bring it back, and then fly out the next day. So I'll think of more, but just off the top of my head, those are 2 really, really cool ones.
You got anything, Jack, that like stands out in your career?
Well, this is kind of, I'm cheating a little bit, but yeah, there were just so many stories of like, I'm super into tellies, and we've had just crazy, and for us, and I'm speaking for Nick, but he'd probably agree. Yeah, it's great when we end up seeing like an immaculate 52 Blackguard telly that's just like, wow, that's in incredible condition. We're so lucky to be looking at this. Hopefully we can get it. But it's usually even more interesting and cool to us when we just see crazy looking, beat up, stickers on the finish, totally smoked out tellies, and we've had a few of those show up over the years. But the story that stands out most to me, just in terms of the vintage and the vibe and the kind of things that we end up seeing and doing, was when I was working as an assistant manager in the vintage room. We closed the shop at 9:00. It's like 8:57. I'm ready to roll, and in walks Jimmy Page. Yes.
Oh, hello, James.
In walks Jimmy Page, and it's just me, and he is like, he number one for me on probably a list of 3 number ones, but he, as far as just like the whole thing, playing, writing songs, just being who he is, it was the equivalent of meeting that person in your life in whatever walk of life you have. And so now it's just me and Jimmy Page in this room alone, and I know no one else is coming in because he's just I think he and Robert Plant were doing that gig way back in the day that they did a bunch of shows with. And so I'm like, okay, so how do I deal with this? And I had like a personal creed that if I ever met anyone who was just integral in changing my life or inspiring me or whatever, I would make a point of introducing myself and saying, hey, I just wanted to thank you. You've changed my life, etc. And so now I had no choice but to do that because I have to engage. I can't just let him walk around and then
Right.
he leaves and I'm like, wow, I just had the chance to talk to Jimmy Page and I completely froze, although I was pretty frozen. So back then, speaking about having just more of good, just more of vintage in general, we actually had 2 bursts in a display case. I think they were both 59s. I think one of them was the Mick Ralph's burst that we had for a while back then before we moved it. And so he's walking around, he's checking stuff out. The first thing he does is walk over to some Gretsch hollow bodies that we had hanging out, and he picks one up and just starts playing. So there's Jimmy Page playing a 6120 in front of me, and I'm just like, But we go over to the bursts, and he's like, what? He's like, and forgive me, I may or may not attempt to do an English accent right now. I think I'm not going to. But anyway, he goes, does that say $60,000 or whatever, $100,000? And I'm like, yeah. And I'm like, and you're to blame for that. And I was like, yeah, okay. I just accused Jimmy Page of, making the burst market go nuts. But so I think we chuckled.
You're not wrong.
So. No, and so it just kind of came out, and of course I was like I was like a little kid at that point. So and there's been other times when just like people who just have, for me, literally changed my life and changed the world and all that have come into the room. But that's one that stands out. And I think as far as like actual guitars that we were able to buy, Nick, I think that one that we ended up either getting from Jay up north or selling to him, that just super cool telly that had, I think it had a sticker on it, but it was super smoked out. Might have even been a broadcaster, but we've seen a few of those come through.
That was a 53 Telecaster that was just like, I mean, it was, you could just tell it was played in bars forever. And someone had put a Foghorn Leghorn sticker on it.
Right.
And like the headstock had started cracking. So they just took a nail and just hammered, put a nail through the top of it. I mean, it was just a farm boy guitar, you know what I mean? Just a good old boy guitar. And like the tragic ending to that story is that someone bought it, and along the way, they've removed the sticker, they removed all the smoke, and it's still a very cool guitar, but it just looks so much cooler. I think you've actually seen it on my Instagram because I've posted it a couple times. But that's cool. Then and then it's a small story too. I'll shamelessly plug one of my own guitars because I have it here. I got this. This is a 30s L00, right? This walked into one of our stores. I can't remember where, but it was completely wrecked. The bridge was just completely pulling off the guitar. And it also came in with a 30s shade top D18, which shade top means sunburst if people aren't familiar with it, which are just incredibly rare. So we didn't end up getting the D18, but we ended up buying this, and I had my friend Joel go through it and completely dial it back in and whatever. So the small world story is that I was at the Nashville Guitar Show. I think it was a year or 2 years ago, and I was walking around and I saw the D18. Like, it was unmistakable. It just had the patina that you would, and stuff like that. And like my buddy David had bought it. So I was going through, and he's like, had all the paperwork and pictures. So I found original photos of the owner playing this guitar, right?
Wow.
Alongside photos with the D18. And you can see, his name was Cowboy Bill Massey or something like that. But you could see like where the wear started to all line up and everything, and it's just, like cool stuff like that, that you just don't expect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One thing that crept into my mind while we were talking about this, it's easy to like get really excited about, a Burst or a Blackguard Telly or something like that. But there are also a lot of guitars that are, technically vintage now that aren't necessarily in that unobtainable price point that, for most people, right? Like most people, even if they stumble upon a Burst, they're probably not going to be able to afford to buy it. It's just the reality of what Jimmy Page has helped do to the vintage guitar market. But what do you guys view as some really cool, really vibey vintage guitars that are actually, more reasonable that somebody could actually maybe afford to purchase, if they're an average kind of working person?
I can, Nick, let me jump in there. I had a thought. That's a really great question. And I think it's a question that me and the team had to think about when we took over the team and kind of built out an actual team that was based in Hollywood, that all we did was look at guitars that were either walking into Hollywood but mostly at the other, like you said, 200 at this point, 300 stores around the country. And that was like, well, it was the question of like, what is vintage for us? And right. Up until that point, we had really focused on, and I think it's pertinent to kind of maybe the bigger picture of what we're up to these days. And that is like, for me, I couldn't afford a Burst when I was first getting into vintage guitars. And when I came to work for Guitar Center and the vintage room and the vintage business in particular, there was a real focus, at least what we could manage from that store, when we didn't have like a really great network around the country of handling a valuable or maybe vintage or high-end used guitar at a store that's 300 miles away, and it's 8 o'clock our time, it's 5 o'clock, and it's just like, how can we do that? And so we kind of had, I think the thought process was more around catering to just the higher end, rarer stuff that we could buy at a show, that we had our hands on. And we kind of shied away from refinished guitars or guitars that might have had a headstock break or things like that, which are a lot of what at that point, and to your point about what we could afford, that's what I could afford. I could probably afford, or somehow by, hook or crook, get a refinished, Telly, or maybe a 70s Telly or something like that, but I couldn't buy a Blackguard Telly or a, whatever else the case may be. Mm-hmm. So when we put the team together, part of my thought process was, and because the market it wasn't just us, it was the entire guitar market and vintage market had fallen off a cliff, just like the housing. I mean, basically it was the same activity with vintage guitars. What can we do to rebuild this business and get guitars into people's hands? And part of the philosophy that I pushed at that point was like, we have to be buying refinished guitars. We've got to get, as long as it makes sense and we come to a good resolution with the person that's selling it and everybody's happy with it, we need to make those available, because that's where, most of the people's heads are at, especially post-recession. So we did that, and we ended up getting tons of cool guitars that we might not have bought, 2 years before or whatever, by virtue of, putting a plan together and just being cognizant of like what was the reality in the market at that point. And so we've done that ever since. And we've also bought plenty of, really valuable, cool, high-end guitars as well. But I think part of what we're trying to do now is reinvest in especially now that we have that, it's established for over a decade now, how we buy the guitars, what the process is. It's very in depth. There's, 7 people on the team. There's always someone there, multiple people that we can talk about buying essentially a more risky thing when you're looking at a guitar via pictures and phone calls and things like that. So now we're kind of reinvesting in this notion of, well, let's get back a little bit to what we used to do in bringing in the higher end stuff and being more aggressive with, naked shows and just when something does walk in, so that we're still doing what we did that helped us, get back on the right track with buying things that, might not be a pristine, slab board Strat. We'll buy that refin slab board Strat for sure. But now, hey, let's make sure we're not letting that pristine slab board Strat get away at a show or get away from us to the best of our ability at a store. So it's kind of like being, I think, trying to be we try to encompass whatever might turn somebody on with a quote unquote vintage guitar, because there's lots of different definitions, and people have a different sense of, well, what's really vintage, what isn't vintage, when does it become used? That's totally subjective. You can't really say 100% what is or isn't vintage, but it's about like all of that, right? So that we're taking care of the person whose budget is $1,500 or $2,500, and then getting into, especially now with what we're doing with the business, having a wide array of that more collectible, higher end. I had one when I was a kid, but I want to get that gold top, that 50s gold top now, and just being more aggressive about having more of that super cool collectible stuff too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just, I find like I tend to gravitate towards the if I'm looking at vintage stuff, to like kind of off the beaten path stuff a little bit. The Junior's like the most classic thing that I have, but like I got a 65 Melody Maker double pickup that I just love to death, and that wasn't that expensive. I think I paid $1,200 for it or something like that. My 74 Telly Custom, that was not that expensive. It was just under $2,000 when I got it a few years ago. I know they're a little more now, but I tend to like these kind of weirdos, is why I wanted to get into that territory with it. Because I think not everything old is cool, but if it's older, it tends to be more likely that it is cool, at least for me. I don't know why I feel that way, but that is kind of how I tend to look at things.
Yeah, the 70s were great eras for stuff like that. For the 70s Japanese stuff are great guitars. The Ibanez, what's the Grecos, like all that stuff. They're all fantastic. There's still good 60s era guitars that you can get too. I mean, vintage Mustangs, like you said, vintage melody makers, like you can get a thin or, a single cut melody maker, which are just great. And then, like I always say, like, be okay with issues. So like, if something has a broken headstock, like, it's fine. Like, don't pay, full price, obviously for it, but chances of it breaking again, probably zero. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. If it's been routed for pickups or whatever, like, I mean, that's all the stuff that I like, And so if you get into that 70s era stuff, especially with, Gibsons and Fenders, it's significantly, they're significantly less than what you can find. But like, it's for another show and tell. This is just this is a 70s Les Paul Deluxe. It's got a headstock repair. It's beat up. You know what I mean? It's like the knobs don't work. These two knobs, but like, I don't care. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Because you can get stuff like that for good deals, and it has a story. So
yeah. I think, and for me, I think sometimes that, like, I just got this Les Paul recording that has a weird burn mark in the middle in between the pickups. And I'm just like, how did this even happen? What were you doing? It's not a cigarette. It's not like, I don't know what you were doing, but there's a big old burn mark like on the pickup and in the middle in between the pickups. But I'm also like, I kind of like that it's there because it's weird and it doesn't make any sense. And it's a little mystery in life. It just keeps us wondering, keeps us thinking about stuff, and it plays great. So yeah, I think that's a really good message though. It's like, be okay with some things like that. If you're just going to play the thing anyway, you're going to cause some damage to it most likely. So who cares if it's not perfect, as long as it's cool. I think that's great advice, really. That's cool.
Yeah, and I think the good thing about this, or the great thing about these guitars, is that there's something for everybody. And the key is just, if you're in the market for something, then it helps to have friends. It helps to, get second opinions about stuff that you're buying. But if you want something that, you're just going to leave in the case or put in a case, a clear case that you're looking at, and you want it to be of that level of collectability or pristine condition, cool. But there are way more guitars available to people that do have issues. But what I was going to say is, like, part of the story of all this and just the vibe of it all. And, I know Nick's the same way. It's like looking at the old Fender factory videos on YouTube. And, we're lucky to have a guy named David Maddox on our team, who was a Fender employee for like 30 plus years, maybe even might be over 40 years. And just hearing him talk about, it's like, well, this is that. And be like, well, no, actually we had to bend that part of that, trem arm by hand because, we couldn't get them sent in that way from the manufacturer. It just all adds up to why people who are into vintage and why it's just the vibe is palpable. And then when you start having people in your circle, either you like walk into a group of people that are like that, or you start making friends who are into the same thing, it just becomes this community of awesomeness and really great, histories, and let alone all the music that was made with all these things. And I'm sure like a recording bass or guitar, a Gibson, not going to be number one on a lot of people's lists of I have to have that. But if you were to like be able to look at all the albums that were made in the 70s and whatever, there are recording basses and guitar, Les Paul recording basses and guitars all over those things. There are Tyscos all over those things. You see pictures of these studio guys playing those just crazy guitars. Maybe they got like a little deal where they're getting, an extra $100 if they have a picture of them in one of the rags that has them playing this really crazy, like a guitarian or whatever it might be. But it just all adds up to just so much cool history and it's fun.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it's the other thing about it too is it just, you don't really get to this level without kind of going through a few other stages first. So everybody's got their, starter pack with the battery powered amp story, and then he gets in, and it just kind of is this connection point that we all form at some level. And some people get really into pedals or really into amps. Everybody has kind of their thing that they gravitate towards, and I'm just sort of hopelessly obsessed with all of it, so that's dangerous. But it becomes a real community of people you can meet and hang out with. And through doing the podcast, I've gotten to interview some of my musical heroes, and my wife has been there for a couple of those, and she's like, these guys are just like you.
So true.
She's like, I've never heard anybody else obsess over the way Pelham blue fades into a green. I'm like, yeah, that's so cool though, isn't it awesome? And yeah, we're just all big nerds at the end of the day. That's what it is.
There's no doubt about it. And good thing. So I mentioned the team, and that all we basically do is look at this stuff coming in, and it's not just vintage. We have, we'll have, if you have a question about, if you're an associate out in the field and you have like a boutique amp or whatever the case may be, a used amp, not necessarily a, like a twin reverb or a vintage Vox or something like that. We have people that are like on those, because at any given time, there's probably 500 people at a store at a Guitar Center somewhere in the United States, trying to work a trade or sell us something. And man, if we didn't have our team of nerds just like looking at that stuff, it would be really hard. And because you're literally just doing this from the time you punch in on your laptop to the time that you clock out. And the great thing is that we've got this little group, and we're talking to each other all day long about, well, what do you think about this? And what do you think about that? And just bouncing off before we, say, yeah, let's do it. Let's, it sounds like a good deal. So thank God for the guitar nerds out there, because it's not easy necessarily just reaching out to the field going, hey, we have an opening on the team, because it's got to be a special kind of guitar nerd to work with us for sure.
Yeah. So going back a little bit, you mentioned, and I'm just curious, everybody does have their own definition of what is vintage. And I'm getting to the age where more and more stuff that I grew up with is becoming quote unquote vintage, or at least that's how I see it advertised sometimes. I'm like, well, that feels weird. But internally, I'm guessing you have some sort of guideline or dividing line or something, because you go into a Guitar Center and you'll see things labeled as vintage or used. Where is that line for you guys, or at least how do you find it when it's a bit of a nebulous term?
Let me take that one. So it is nebulous, but where we kind of start is, okay, is it from the 70s? Is it something that we can discuss and agree that it's probably, this is considered a collectible brand? Is it a niche brand? So it might not be, there aren't price points, that's for sure, because it's like a Teisco that might have seen better days, and we're gonna put it up at $3.99 or $4.99 or whatever, is still to us collectible. We're gonna put it into vintage. Now there might be one that's had tons of changes and it just has kind of moved out of that, mostly probably the collectability discussion within the team. We don't have any hard and fast rules about what is vintage or what isn't vintage. And it's also like, what are the people in the market doing? When Nick mostly handles shows for us, I've gone to a few this year. I used to go to a bunch. I'm back into, now that we're, trying to really reinvest in our higher end cool collectible guitars. I'm hitting the road again. But it's like, would this be vintage at a show? Because even at the shows, you'll see people advertise them as vintage or used or whatever. It's not the easiest, to be frank. It's not the easiest thing to feel completely like we've figured it out. This is what is vintage and this what isn't. This is not vintage. It's more a discussion within the team. And the guidance to the stores is anything that they know is older, call it 20 years, 25 years, has to go through the vintage team. There's that is part of the process. If it's a Martin, if it's a Fender, or if you have a question about it, those need to go through us. If they have a Les Paul from 2015, maybe a custom shop, we have to, there's so many things going on in the field, and some, like I mentioned before, so many actual transactions occurring on an hourly, daily basis that we have to trust, train them as best we can, have an open door policy in terms of supporting any questions they might have about acquisitions. But it's mostly our team kind of working together to go, yeah, that's a no-brainer. And it's just, we all kind of know that that's vintage. A 75 Les Paul Custom is always going to be vintage unless it's just had every single part changed on it, refinished, broken headstock. At that point, we might go, you know what, that's moved too far away from how it left the factory. We're going to put it in used. But we have to have that a little, it does become a little bit objective within the team. But fortunately, we've got a lot of experience on the team, and we're able to, I think, pretty well hit get close to the pin on what makes sense. That's not to say someone might not be looking at our website and be like, there's no way that's vintage. It's just really hard to satisfy every version of what someone might think is vintage or isn't vintage. You know what I mean?
100%. Yeah. What spurred that question was A, when we were talking about it earlier, but B, I'm good friends with the team over at Rev Amps, and Derek just did a video about 90s Gibsons, and here's some things to look for, or at least what he's discovered are things to look for. And I'm just sitting here going wow, we're talking about 90s as if, we talk about it in eras of music all the time, but now we're talking about 90s guitars as in the same kind of tone and reverence as 60s guitars. Not exactly, but here's some of the weird things you look for that were from this era. This sticker was here and blah, blah, blah. All these little points that he was talking about what he looks for in his 90s Gibsons that he's kind of collecting. And I'm just this is just a weird thing to have seen shift to where that was just a guitar. And now it's starting to be vintage, or at least in some people's eyes, starting to be vintage. And so it seems like it's an ever evolving topic as well, because every year things get older, right?
Yeah, I think so. And Nick, if you wanted to jump in, sorry, I'm cutting you off here, but it's also when I'm driving in the car and I put on the oldies station, it's all new stuff, or at least for me, it's new stuff, right? This is not a classic rock song, but so it's almost like the same thing. What's classic rock now? What's oldies now? We try not to get away. We try to stay away from being super definitive from a year. I mean, we have a general sense of what year would qualify, but to your point, it's literally changing. And one thing I'm frankly grateful for, because I don't want to be on the other side of having to be, or I don't want Guitar Center or Nick or our team to be the definitive word, or anyone think for a minute that we, by establishing this as vintage, it is vintage, or because at the end of the day, it's a guitar that happens to be, we think, this old. And, is it vintage? Is it used? It's just kind of it is what it is, and it's valued accordingly. I don't mean just how we value things, just in general. It's is it used? Is it vintage? But what I was going to say is, I'm kind of grateful that it hasn't become this kind of hot topic where no, we've decided that this is vintage and this is used, because it really is kind of nebulous. And we do the best we can to kind of honor the notion of being vintage. And it's more it's collectible. And that's a little bit more easily, we think, to kind of define than a year where it's suddenly nothing is vintage. It's now used. You know what I mean? Yeah.
So going on a different path here, are there any things, and maybe this has gotten a little bit dispelled with the internet, becoming widespread and information being everywhere, but are there any big misconceptions that you guys can dispel? All 60s Fenders had X, or all 50s Gibsons had this, and that's no, they didn't. Are there any big misconceptions out there about certain eras of guitars that are wrong, or just a little off, or anything you guys can dispel?
Well, I'd ask Nick to talk a little bit more about the 70s, because I think the 70s got a really bad rap.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think if you go on the internet, you can argue about anything, right?
Sure.
You know what I mean? You could argue about if this shirt's white or black, right? So I think that there were stuff, obviously, that the Norland eras of Gibson just get a bad rap online, but the fact of the matter is there is great guitars from all eras, right? Even with the most coveted stuff like bursts. Guess what? If you have 3 bursts in a row, one of them's going to sound the best, like, so I try not to, because, like, I try not to just like limit, visibility on anything, because the truth is you'll find a great guitar from any era, right? So that, and then like maybe weight, like everybody's so, like, how much does it weigh now? Like, I never, that was never a big thing to me,
I don't really care. Can I pick it up? That's all. All right. As long as I can pick it up.
Is it Thor's hammer? No.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, we've sold Joe, I don't know how many guitars, hundreds. He's never not once asked how much a guitar weighs. You know what I mean? So like, I think people like obsess about that, and some of them are going to be a little heavier. If you're playing 3 hours a night in a club and you got a bad back, get a lighter guitar. Like, worry about it then, but don't just buy something because it weighs 6 ounces more than you'd like.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, you'd have to give me like something specific, but yeah,
Yeah, I think it's kind of like that, like somehow the guitars that left Fender in 1964 or early 65 are in and of themselves better than the, CBS era. There's things that happened during the course of the 60s. Like some of the best, or like earlier 50 Strats sound better than later 50 Strat. The best 50 Strat I ever heard in my life was a 58. And I think there's something was going on with the way they were winding pickups, or, a switch to a slightly different wire. But 58 pickups to me are just like completely insane across the board, generally speaking, as a group of, 58s versus 54s or whatever. So, and then in 68, there's something else then, and maybe it's my Hendrix goggles going on there. But I think ultimately it's like you take, like I did a video recently on like how to buy a vintage Strat. And I do not know everything about what people should know when it comes to buying vintage Strats, but I do know that it's like, what do you want? And take the time to do what Nick's talking about, which is don't just push something to the side. Don't put a 65 Strat to the side because it's a CBS Strat. Don't put a 75 super cool black Telly, that they didn't make a ton of, aside because it's a mid 70s and maybe it's a little heavier or whatever. It's a little tricky because there's so much internet presence and so many people buying and selling used and vintage instruments that, ultimately you want to have a guitar in your hands before you make the decision to keep it or not. But people are really good about, and certainly our return policy is pretty insane when it comes to used, and very solid when it comes to vintage. Get it in your hands, check it out, go to a store, go to a Guitar Center, go to your local store, play the stuff, and try not to have too many preconceived notions about eras and what, you might have read on the internet. Like really, and this also goes back to something you were talking about earlier, which is essentially I took as like the learning curve. It is totally about the learning curve. And what I would still say is, having done this for over 30 years, between doing it on my own and then with Guitar Center, I'd be the first person to tell you, I know, a tenth of what's out there when it comes to vintage stuff. And that's why it's so important to, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, to have a network of people or at least people that you can bounce things off of. And then just, get in your hands, and you may end up wanting something specific, cool, then you go get that. But just be open to deals that you might be able to get by just changing your thought process a little bit and maybe getting a few extra opinions and feedback on stuff.
I, for one, would love it if everybody continued to talk trash on Norlin-era Gibsons. That would be wonderful for me, because I don't own 3 of them that I absolutely love to death. So, yeah. Norlin Gibsons are awful. Don't ever need nobody buy one ever. You should give them all to me. I'll dispose of them. Yeah, that's
nice.
That's been a big one for me. It's like I'm discovering, like, maybe I just have a thing for Norlin-era Gibsons. I don't know. I like the logo, how it's a little different. I don't know. It's a weird thing. I'm starting to notice I have a type.
Well, that's cool, man.
Yeah. Well, we are approaching the end of the episode. And I have 2 classic questions that I always wrap this thing up with. And since there are 2 of you, we'll probably get to those a little sooner. But before I do that, I like to give the guests a chance to take the stage. And you're talking to a few thousand people right now. You can plug anything you want to plug. You can say hi to your grandma. You can do whatever you want right now. The floor is yours to kind of say whatever you want to say at this moment.
Nick, you ready to go?
I just sell cool guitars to cool people, man. Like if you need something, let me know. You can hit me on Instagram. You can, I don't know if we're going to link email addresses or anything like that in this or whatnot, but always happy to help. Always happy to talk gear. Always happy to give a second opinion. The amount of just photographs I've amassed in the last decade is like, I have photographs of pretty much anything, and I always tell people it's okay to be wrong. Like you're going to make mistakes, just don't be wrong alone, So, yeah, again, always happy to help. And thanks for having us on too, Blake. It's been fun.
Of course. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great message. It's, taking a partner and everything. For me, again, like Nick said, thanks for having us. It's part of what we're trying to do is get out there and talk to the people. And we're definitely in a position where, as I mentioned earlier, we're being more aggressive about getting to even more shows. And, typically Nick would do 12 shows in a year. We're probably going to do about 17 or 18 this year, doing shows that we've never done before. Hope to see Adam. We're working on having just insanely cool stuff across the board. And this speaks to our used inventory as well. And I mean, there's a finite number of vintage guitars, no matter how you define them. There are always new used guitars coming into the market and getting produced. And I think companies are doing a better job than ever of making what the people want. So that's a really nice kind of trend that I'm seeing out there. But, we're interested in talking to people. We're interested in buying cool guitars. If you're out there and you've got a collection, you've been thinking about moving it, we're here. You can talk to any store person and they can get you in touch with us. I think it's really exciting again, I'm speaking for Nick, I apologize, but it's super exciting for us because ultimately we might just be like the kind of the caretakers of this stuff. But really quick little anecdote, when I first started kind of running stores for Guitar Center and getting a little bit more, not necessarily, I was still into vintage and doing that and all that, but I was like, I'm running a store here. It's a different reality. I got home one night and my wife asked me, she said, well, like, does it ever bother you that you're like selling? You're a salesperson. And I don't know why she asked me that. I don't recall having a discussion about it prior to her asking me that, but I'm glad she did because I was immediately able to go, God, no, I love it, because ultimately it's getting these pieces that we're caretaking, whether it's to your point earlier, a Strat pack or, the first pedal you got, or, a ridiculously collectible, awesome Fender, Telly or Les Paul or whatever. It's a super satisfying feeling being in that relationship with people and working to. And then the other side of that is if someone's we've had plenty of situations where someone really needed to move something because something's going on in their lives. And our approach is we just want to help. And whether that's the bottom line. I mean, it really is about a bunch of really solid people trying to do right by our company and right by our customers when they do bring things in or they want to buy a cool guitar. So really trying to make sure that we have something for everybody. And I think we're doing a pretty good job with that right now.
Right on. Perfect. And for everybody listening / watching, whatever links you need will be where the words are, whether you're watching on YouTube or listening on your podcast player, wherever the description is, all the links that we will discuss after the show will be there so you can get a hold of these guys and maybe get your hands on something cool. So that'll be nice and easy for everybody. All right, final questions. First one, what is your favorite Boss pedal?
I don't use pedals. Oh, I guess no. I do have. I think I have a DD3 that hasn't been out of the box, and I actually don't even know where it is.
You don't even know where it is?
How about your favorite pedal? Go back in the Wayback Machine. At some point, you were into pedals, dude.
Well, I think the first pedal I got was like a multi-prod. I think it was a Korg G3 pedal or something like that. But no, I have a vintage Rat pedal, which are great. Vintage Rats are awesome. I have a Keeley compressor, and I have the DD3 somewhere. And I think,
all right, well, DD3s are super cool. Definitely had a few of those. Probably had every version at some point or another. But yeah, Boss pedal. Mm-hmm. I'm gonna go. I think it's the Metal Zone 2. I think
MT2?
there was a second one.
The MT2 it's I've got the murdered out version right here.
Nice. Look at that. That is hot sauce, man.
Oh man, it's good times. It's good times.
I used that sucker because it's a cool pedal. I mean, it might not be. I definitely was more of like the TS-808, Tube Screamer, Klon, like overdrive or maybe a little bit of distortion. But that was one of those sleeper pedals that you could especially bring into recording situations and totally get some badass tones. So that's my answer, and that I'm gonna stick with.
I like it. Yeah, see, that's the thing is the EQ on it is fantastic. It's so powerful. Totally. You can make it do a million things, but it's also its downfall because you can make it sound real bad if you don't know what you're doing. So I think,
and I've done that for sure.
Yeah. So
I would definitely do that because I don't know what I'm doing.
All right, final question. What is your favorite kind of pizza?
Ooh, I'm from Michigan, so I'd like a good Detroit style pizza.
Oh, Detroit style.
That's really good. Yeah, just pepperoni and ham, man. That's kind of how I get down.
Pepperoni and ham.
Wow. A Detroit slice? That sounds pretty good. It's been a while since I had a Detroit style slice. I quite like them. They're good.
It's good stuff. Mm-hmm. But it's no New York City, just John's of Bleecker.
Oh, man.
Cheese slice.
Oh,
that's
John's
it.
Of Bleecker. I love it so much.
That's my favorite slice on the planet. There used to be a famous Ray's, or it might have been a famous original Ray's, or original famous Ray's on 11th, and I think maybe 11th and 6th or something like that. And it's no longer there, sadly. And it was just a mess of a slice of pizza with just the cheese that you got at most of those Ray's. And that was probably until it went away. It was right there between John's and that one. But just give me a good slice of New York City cheese pizza, and I am super happy.
You're a man after my own heart. I love the New York slices. I love John's on Bleecker, specifically. Grimaldi's. I mean, I could go on and on. I'm a big fan.
Anything happening up in Portland that's even remotely acceptable?
Oh, yeah.
When it comes to pizza?
Yeah. We've got some really, really good spots. Yes.
Yeah, they've done a good job in LA in the last 5 years of, you got your Prime Pizza, now we've got the, there's a few like solid, like, okay, that's, I'm down with that. It's funny. I was watching the, One Bite Everybody Knows the Rule videos earlier. So yeah, I'm a pizza nut. My 12-year-old son and I, it's all about the pizza.
Well, so if you ever come up here, I'll take you around. We've got some good spots up here these days. Like, and some actually like some places that have ranked really well in the world, in various places. So it's almost to the point. And this is gonna sound crazy. It's almost to the point where it's like, oh great, we got another pizza place we have to try. Okay, all right. Well, I can
relate to that for sure.
Well, guys, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time and everything. And I think we can go ahead and wrap it up if that's cool with you.
Yep. Sounds good. Had a blast. Thank you so much, Blake. Nick, thanks, buddy.
Yep,
thanks.
Of course. All right, everybody. For Jack and Nick, this is Blake. And as always, folks, good luck and good tones. All right, folks, there you have it. There's another episode in the can. If you enjoyed this chat, there is a lot more wherever you listen to your podcasts. I've been doing this show for almost a decade, and if you go to Apple, Spotify, etc., you're going to find over 400 episodes of conversations just like this one available for you, with more coming out every single Monday. I'm, of course, going to be producing the video version for YouTube more consistently. You'll see those happening here, so if you like this, you can like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff, and all of the information you'll need to contact these dudes is down there in the description of this video, so please go there. Additionally, if you need more content, please check out Patreon, where for just $5 a month, you not only get the ad-free episodes of this very podcast, you will also get extra bonus episodes beamed right to your ears every single week, and this week is no exception. So thank you to everybody who's done that. Thank you to everybody who has taken the time. I appreciate you very much, and until next time, I'll talk to you on the internet very, very soon. Bye-bye.